Alright, so my name is Rami, and this is Al-Hassan, this is Youssef. We're undergraduate students here at the University of Ottawa, and we're going to be doing discussion. Each of us chose a certain film. To be specific, it's an Arab film. And we're going to be talking about a certain topic called gender portrayals, and how men and women, their traits and their characteristics are portrayed within each of the films. Alright, so now for our first big question to get into the analysis of the films. We decided to compare based on any emphasized traits and characteristics that we see within specific characters that we follow throughout the films, and that will get a sense of the restrictions and the portrayals that the filmmakers of that nation's society is trying to send as a message to the audience. So, Hassan, would you like to begin?
Yeah, for sure. So in my movie Wajda, as you know, it took place in Saudi, and basically throughout the movie you can see a lot of constraint and restriction placed on women, and this wasn't seen for men, and to the point where it was almost considered oppression, right? A lot of people consider the women in Saudi very, very oppressed. And in Saudi, basically women were placed in a separate category. You know, they're segregated, almost legally discriminated against, you know, and under the guise of tradition, you know, which almost doesn't make sense, because as Saudi progressed and became more urbanized and modern, they didn't change these values, you know.
They're still a little
back to the
some people think backwards
yeah,
in a sense.
Haven't
evolved with
haven't
time.
progressed, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and on the other hand, men were actually portrayed as more dominant, you know. They were able to, through their expression of patriarchy in the society, they were able to do almost whatever they wanted.
Okay.
So on one hand, women, like for example Wajda's mother, she would have to ask for permission regarding anything, work, if she could go out, you know, kind of stuff like that. On the other hand, her husband, Wajda's father, he was getting remarried to a younger woman, despite Wajda's mother's distaste. You know, she was very, you know, she was heartbroken about it.
So no restrictions, no rules.
Yeah, basically, they could do whatever they wanted despite the woman's feelings, you know. And there's a really actually interesting scene where you could see that it was kind of, it's not really about patriarchy, but like you could see that men could do whatever they wanted. You know, this creepy old guy basically catcalled Wajda. Wajda's a 10-year-old girl.
She's 10, yeah.
She's literally 10, and he was catcalling her when she was walking down the street to go to school. So it was very, you know, like you could see that men could do almost anything and get
without punishment, basically. Like,
yeah.
It's very odd.
Yeah.
So I hear that your film is similar to Hassan's film in the sense that there's certain restrictions and submissiveness within the different genders that are portrayed. Can you explain and touch upon that?
Yeah, for sure. So there was obviously many similarities, because you know in the typical Middle Eastern culture, women are forced to be more accepting and more kind of timid and more submissive, while the men usually hold that more dominant, more assertive.
Yeah.
Exactly. So and that's in a way that it was similar. You know, that's basically in typical Middle Eastern culture. We know that that's how gender roles are portrayed. But
stereotypical.
The stereotypical
ones.
ones.
All for all, of course. Yeah.
Exactly.
I'll touch on that a little bit later. Go.
Exactly.
Continue.
But for me, in my movie, that Egyptian culture in a way was different than the Saudi Arabian culture, because obviously we know that Saudi Arabian culture is much more strict as a country than Egypt is, and that's the way like you mentioned, that kind of women are placed in a
separate category.
Yeah, they're kind of like discriminated based on their gender, and that's usually attributed towards tradition.
Affects their social class, right?
Exactly. Now, the thing is, what's different between Egypt and Saudi Arabia is that in Egypt, the gender stereotypes of a woman are determined by their social class. So say if you're a woman from a lower social class, you kind of hold a typical role as a wife, a daughter,
Mother.
Just a common housewife.
The common housewife,
So,
exactly.
Take care of the family, and a maid or something.
Exactly, those are the common roles of a woman who comes from a lower social class. However, when you have a woman that's coming from a higher social class, this woman has the roles as any other man could do, and especially this is when we're talking about in the workforce.
Okay.
So they kind of have the same opportunities to work, have a career, have a job the same way a man
I didn't know that actually.
Yeah.
Socioeconomic status actually impacts.
Exactly, and there was a lot of similarities between the Egyptian and the Saudi Arabian culture, but as well, of course, due to the strictness of Saudi Arabia, there is clearly many differences between Egypt and Saudi Arabia as well. So, in terms of the movie Cairo Time, I found some examples throughout the film in which it kind of portrayed those stereotypes even further. We know that you know how we talked about men usually are typically seen to be dominant, assertive, powerful, you know, like they run the place.
Mm-hmm.
So a scene in where that was shown in Cairo Time was basically when Juliet was leaving the hotel and she was walking down the street and then all of a sudden she gets approached by a bunch of Egyptian men around her. Now these men, they weren't characters in the movie, they were just clearly like extras in the film, but they were just kind of approaching her and they were catcalling her all at once, and it was a very uncomfortable scene.
They recorded that?
Yeah, it was a very uncomfortable scene in the movie because it was just Juliet walking, and then there's a bunch of basically Egyptian men kind of surrounding her, grabbing her hair, and like kind of trying to get closer and trying to talk to her, as if it's basically as if they've never seen a white lady before.
What does that tell you?
That kind of tells us. It kind of to me personally, it kind of showed me how Egyptian men are very dominant, aggressive, and they kind of like they see themselves above women to the point where. It's like they did
from this film, from what this film is giving you, right? Not obviously like not general.
Obviously not general Egyptian man, but no, due to that specific, because we obviously know that the scene isn't very exactly.
You know, it's not really. It's
not representative of actual
society. Yeah, it's just stereotyping that takes out certain qualities and emphasizing them to make to deliver a message.
Exactly, for sure. So the way it seemed like as if they've never seen a white lady before, the way they were talking to her and attempting to kind of like catcall her and get closer with her.
What message do you get from this scene that the filmmaker is trying to portray about the different gender roles that are being depicted? What do you notice? What's the most an eye opener? What's the one that captures your attention here?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, this film kind of shows us how Rubanetta opens up our eyes on the typical gender stereotypes of women in Egypt that was portrayed in this film, such as kind of they're working at a young age just to make enough money so they can get married.
So another thing I actually wanted to add was that a lot of the restrictions that women in this society, as depicted by Haifa and Mansour, actually it showed that these restrictions were implementations of Islam, right? So they're religious, right? Women had to be veiled in public. They couldn't be in public spaces with other men who weren't, relatives. And see, a lot of the time, it wasn't more of a restriction of the limitations that women have. It's more, some of it was like restrictive to men, to give privacy to women, So it wasn't always oppressive towards women. It would expand to public spheres.
Okay, so there's restrictions to men as well.
Yeah, so it was restrictive to men too, in the sense that they couldn't be, and they couldn't be where women were, and this was shown. This was shown through. Wajda was going to an all-girls school, no boys would be allowed there. There were scenes where like the religious police would actually get involved when a woman would be out of place or step out of line. I remember one girl was caught sending messages to another guy.
بس يا بنات ايش هالضحك والصوت العالي؟ سلامتكم ما تدرون انه صوت البنات ما المفروض يطلع برا ويسمعون الرجال؟ كم مرة لازم نعيد ونزيد؟ صوت المرأة عورة. السلام عليكم أستاذة حصة.
There's still some restrictions on women too, like little girls, for example. Wajda's principal made a big deal kind of about some of the kids they were singing.
Yeah.
Right, and she was like, you can't sing what your voice is your nakedness, kind of thing. It was like it kind of shows that at the same time, yeah, it's to restrict men, but it's also to make women kind of modest in a way, right? You can't show your voice, you can't show your skin, kind of stuff like that, So that's depicted in a lot of scenes throughout the film.
Forced modesty.
Yeah, basically. They're kind of portraying,
which I guess can be kind of seen as oppression.
Yeah, I guess in a way. Yeah.
So oppression on both sides, but you mentioned that the women are a lot more restricted.
A lot more, yeah.
They're restricted, and men have this no rule. I mean, there's certain restrictions too based on religion.
Based on religion,
but
yeah.
other than that,
it's still they can still do
whatever they want to do.
Yeah, that's a lot.
In my film by Nadine Lebekid, where do we go now? You see these very contrasting traits depicted amongst the men and the women of the village. You know, the majority of the men, you get this idea of them being overly proud and hot-tempered, hot-headed, and really aggressive and impulsive, always resorting to war, and they have these destructive capabilities, and they cannot see reason. In the film, you see this message being portrayed, as shown by the women how they behave, where they're very empathetic and protective, showing these like mothering and motherhood.
Like the mother instinct.
Yes, exactly like that. And so they're able to see reason, and they're very logical. Complete opposite of how the men are portrayed here in the film. Now, furthermore, they're always looking towards peace and harmony and putting aside their differences, and they always get along. How the men in this film, majority of them, which I'll mention a few of them now, they have a lot of issues and conflicts that are begin to arise. One of the scenes that really stuck with me was the coffee shop scene, where the men, such as Rabia, as well as another, are discussing some sort of issue, and it becomes a very heated dispute, and results in them beating each other in this very enormous brawl. And Amal is caught up in the middle of it because it's her coffee shop.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens here, she ends up having to break apart the men, and she begins to ridicule and criticize their fighting, condemning it.
Yeah.
And she's claiming, she states that the mothers and the women of the village are tired of losing their sons, and they're tired of suffering and taking up all the consequences that the men, their impulsivity, their rage, and their childish foolishness is resulting in. And she said, she states, you call yourselves men, but you're acting like children. And so this criticism that Rabia receives from her, as well as the other men, its immaturity and such, really tells you, it gives out that emphasis of certain characteristics that the filmmaker Labake wants you to see in Rabia. His impulsivity and fighting, is resorting to violence. It's always this rage that you see constantly throughout various scenes, like as I mentioned, in the coffee shop. And here you see this inability of men to forgive each other. The women are capable of great sacrifice, self-sacrifice, but the men here are very proud, and they don't want to sacrifice that. There's no mercy, there's no forgiveness and such, because they can't. It's beneath them to do that.
They don't want to sacrifice their pride.
Amal here, when she clutches the child, you have that recurring protective instinct about the mother. She has a toddler with her, and she pulls him away from the fighting and the brawl, and that really speaks to you. It emphasizes that protective mothering cautiousness that you don't see with the men.
The mother instinct.
The mother instinct. We'll go back to the mother instinct. It's very prominent as one of the characteristic features in many of the females portrayed in this film.
So I just had a question for you too. I just wanted to know, what themes and concepts did you guys find important in your film?
You wanna
Okay. So in my film, actually, like a very important concept or theme that I found actually was the idea of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So it really brought forth the idea that women in this society, especially Wajda, right? They're trying to push boundaries to a point,
Yeah.
Especially her, where she was trying to ride a bike, where in her society the norms were that women would not be allowed to ride bikes, right?
Yeah.
So basically, it envisioned an alternate reality, or where oppressed women could express themselves, kind of thing,
Okay, I see what you mean.
Yeah. So. And they would express this basically through a rebellion against authority or the norms that were seen, right? And I feel like a really important thing to mention is that this film is the first feature-length film by a female Saudi director.
Wow.
So in a sense, it itself portrayed the success of the filmmaker in pushing boundaries, So she herself was resisting against this oppression or restriction in society, and in the same time was showing that in the film.
So I know we're speaking about gender portrayals and such, and so what we're discussing, it's important to note that what we're discussing is what we're perceiving as the filmmaker's message towards certain traits that you find within the males and females or certain characters within the various scenes of our films, right? So in that sense, you shouldn't, there's this sort of temptation to, when you watch something, to generalize that, and and that brings in the idea, this concept of stereotyping. And so I just like to note that that's something important that I noticed, because a lot of traits and a lot of things that I saw in my film as well, I'm sure you guys can agree in yours, they're very, they're oversimplified, and it's common amongst all the women or all the men that you see, or specific ones also, but it's very emphasized. And in reality, the reality situation is that may not be the case, of course. So something I'd like to touch on also is that my film, in my opinion, it seemed more like a satire, in that a satire is basically this type of criticism. The filmmaker's message uses like humor and comedy and such to point out and expose the weaknesses of the society that's depicting. It's important to have an understanding that in Lebanese, as I've read through some articles actually, Lebanese war cinema, there's a certain bias towards men being the ones that are the culprits of conflict, and there's this ongoing portrayal of women being these passive and silent beings, where they're either depicted as they're
not taking part.
Yeah, they're not taking part in the destructive, in the rage and such. However, this is not the case. In the context of the Lebanese civil war, yes, men were the ones that were orchestrating it, but also women were at the heart of the conflict. They were also part of it as well. So it's just important to know that there's certain biases that Lebanese war cinema, as well as other features and such that you guys mentioned, that may not be complete accurate representations, and we shouldn't take.
No, you shouldn't generalize.
You can't generalize these things. So that's what I thought was important to mention. Yeah, I really enjoyed the things that, you brought up a lot of good points that I didn't know before about the Egyptian society and restrictions and the status and whatnot. So
social status.
I felt like I really learned something from this discussion, and I just wanted to thank you both for being here.
Thank you too.
All right, guys.
Thank you.
I'll see you guys around.
Thank you.
Take care, man.
Have a good one.